The 1992 Los Angeles Uprising, the Cambodian genocide, Japanese American incarceration. What you know isn't always the full story. Our new podcast, Inheriting, about Asian American and Pacific Islander families where the past is personal.
Korean Americans, we call it 사이구.
Did you ever realize when you were a child that you became an orphan?
Camp was such a hard time. How do you think you got through it?
Listen to Inheriting from LAist Studios and the NPR network, wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And welcome to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here today for an author chat with Rosa Kwon Easton about her debut novel, White Mulberry. As always, Books and Boba is supported in part by our listeners. So if you'd like to become a bigger part of our book club, head on over to patreon.com/booksandboba to become an official member. Our Patreon supporters gain access to our members-only Discord server, as well as monthly bonus podcasts. So definitely hope to see more of you there.
Yeah, so we had a great chat with Rosa. We talked about her grandmother, who, is like the inspiration for this book, about her time in 1930s Japan, living under colonial rule and being an immigrant and suffering the discriminations against Koreans. We talked about how Rosa became a writer and how new beginnings for her has been a rewarding process.
Yeah, so please enjoy our conversation with Rosa Kwon Easton.
And we are here with Rosa Kwon Easton to discuss her debut novel, White Mulberry, a rich and deeply moving portrait of a young Korean woman in 1930s Japan who is torn between two worlds and who must reclaim her true identity to provide a future for her family. Welcome to the show, Rosa.
Thank you, Rira and Marvin. I'm happy to be here today.
So I would like to start our conversation with a little icebreaker. As diasporans, we live between two cultures and often exist under two names, whether that is by choice or by the complications and of us trying to survive. So what is the meaning behind your English and Korean names?
Well, that's a great question and a good icebreaker. Rosa came from the initial R. I have two younger brothers, Oliver and Kenneth, and our names together spell R-O-K. And so when my parents came from Korea, they thought, what were they going to name their three children? And so they named us after the Republic of Korea, basically.
Oh my gosh.
So I got the R, my brother Oliver got the O, and my brother Kenneth got the K. So I guess you can call us a patriotic family, but we're really not. It was just a way to name the three of us. And my dad consulted with a Korean friend of his when we first got here, and he gave him an American baby name book. And there weren't that many R's, and I think they were thinking Rose. Rose might be a good name, but they liked Rosa, so they picked Rosa, and so now I'm often confused with other Rosas who don't look like me, and so it's interesting living in Southern California and being named Rosa, and I walk into the room and they're like, "Oh, you're not who I expected." So anyway, that's the background of my name, Rosa. And my Korean name given at birth is Haewon. And the characters are graceful princess is what was described to me. So Hae is the Chinese character, Hae is grace. And the Won, I think, is young woman or in my family, it was princess. So I was graceful princess. It was very antithetical to who I actually was and wanted to be.
Funny how that works.
Yeah,
Funny how that works.
That's an interesting way. My father named me and my brother after like pop culture people, but not like famous pop culture people, like obscure pop culture people. Like my name is Marvin, and apparently I was named after Marvin Hamlich, who was a film composer. So like he's best known for adapting the ragtime theme for The Sting.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, your dad just wanted to be a cool dad. Yes. When my kid grows up, he'll be cultured. Out of the three of us, though, I am the one with the same name. My English and my Korean name are the same, although they're pronounced differently. Rira in English and Rira in Korean. And that was not by choice either. When we immigrated over here, the immigration officer, they're like, what's her name? And they said it like Rira, and they're like, okay, Rira. And then they spelled it the way I spell it now. And with my brothers, I guess I only had one brother at that time, but his name is Cheesehawk. But the immigration officer was like, yeah, you need to probably come up with an English name for him once he starts going to school. So he just gave us a list of names, and Brian was like the one that my parents decided to go with.
Brian from Cheesehawk?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so it has absolutely no phonetic like relationship with his Korean name. So
yeah. That's so interesting. It is really interesting about names and how they mean so much, and yet when you think about how you received them, there was no rhyme or reason.
No.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, for my Chinese name, though, so my Chinese name is my middle name, Mei Hong. And so my family, we have the tradition of doing generational names. So all the members of the family within my generation have the same middle word for our Chinese names. And for us, it's Mei. For us, it was Mei, which means beautiful, which traditionally is part of feminine names. So for the males of my generation, my parents had to like figure out like how to make it more masculine. So my given name Hong means heroic. So my name actually means like beautiful hero.
Oh, nice. Nice. They all sound so nice. The characters and the meanings. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you studied government and public affairs in undergrad and grad before practicing law. So my question is, like, were you always drawn to literature and creative writing at a young age, or was this something that you gravitated towards later in life?
Well, I always loved reading and writing as a child, but I think I felt an expectation that I needed to do something else with those interests. And so I gravitated more towards social sciences because they seemed like more marketable degrees than creative writing or literature. And my path just became more social science oriented. And then I ended up going to law school, because at that point I was in graduate school and I thought about going to get a PhD. But I, again, sort of being swayed by what I thought were my parents' expectations or my expectations of myself, I gravitated towards something where it seemed more solid and more, a better return on investment. Going to law school seemed like more of a sure thing than doing something more creative, even though I always loved, writing and for pleasure and for, and reading for pleasure. But I always felt those were not, what it was going to help me succeed and have a stable future. So I sort of didn't pursue, I think, my dreams at that age. 40 years ago, when I was choosing my major and deciding on my path. And so at a much later age, I think, and I'm 60 this year and celebrated my hangap, I'm just embracing it finally. So this is my debut, and I don't know if this is going to be, a career as typically, considered a career. You start young, but it's a passion, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Yeah, 60 is a really special age in Korean culture, like you mentioned. And I think it's great that you have found like another path. So like much later in your years. And like I see that with a lot of Korean women as well, because my mom also just turned 60 and I'm seeing her come into her own. Like she was a stay-at-home mom like her entire life, but now she's like going out and like doing like nonprofit stuff. And it's just like really refreshing to see, you know, them kind of find themselves again and, you know, go outside their box.
Yes. No, I love that. I think there's a season for, you know, in people's lives where things are supposed to happen and things change. And in the Hanguk tradition, I think it's considered a rebirth, turning 60. So I'm being born again, you know, as someone I always wanted to be. So I'm really happy. It's been a wonderful journey, a long one, but fruitful. So I'm grateful for you guys doing this podcast and celebrating Asian authors. I think that's terrific.
Oh, thank you so much. So White Mulberry, your debut novel, is inspired by your grandmother's life in 1920s, 1930s Japan. And you said that this was a long process. I can only imagine. What piece of your grandmother's lore first piqued your curiosity and interest in, maybe I should write this down?
Yeah. Well, I think my junior year in college, I spent in Kyoto, Japan, and learned that I had a lot of Korean Japanese relatives. And so that piqued my interest. I, you know, had a little bit of exposure to Asian history, but didn't really know about the occupation and the Pacific War and things. And when I came home, I discovered some documents that were my grandmother's nursing and midwife certificates, and they were written in Japanese. They were dated, I don't know, Showa 4015. That's the Japanese calendar that they use. And I asked my dad, it's like, can you convert that to years? And he said 1938 and 1939. And, you know, being a lawyer, surrounded by documents and, you know, facts and evidence, I looked at it and said, this is really interesting. It had her Korean name, but it was written in Japanese, and it was issued by a prefecture that Kyoto is in Japan. And so I just started becoming more curious about that period in history and our family's you know, lives there, and why my grandmother was there and why my father was born there. So it piqued a lot of interest. And eventually I started interviewing my grandmother. She was aging, and I really wanted to capture her story. And at first she was very reluctant, as I think you've mentioned in your podcast. I've listened to some of your interviews with other authors, and, you know, parents don't want to talk about their past because they were painful. And, but, you know, slowly I just persisted. And so she slowly started opening up, and, it was just fascinating how she ended up there and, in Japan as a young girl, wanting to pursue an education and finding that, you know, she really had to pass or had to do something drastic in order to achieve her dream of becoming a teacher or becoming educated. So that's when she made those choices. And I originally wrote this as a memoir, nonfiction. But I, as a writer, as somebody who's very conscious of making sure historically accurate and so forth, there were gaps. You know, there were places where I really wanted to embellish and enrich the story. And So I did complete a nonfiction manuscript. I did pitch it to agents, but I sort of stopped midstream because I think I realized during this process that I didn't know if this was the book that I really wanted to put out into the world. And so I just took a leap of faith and said, let me try my hand at fiction and see where this takes me. And that was just kind of, jumping in without really knowing where I was going.
I mean, in a way, making it fiction makes it more personal because you are writing in the character's POV rather than just writing it from a third-person view historically. So like, what was the road to publication like when you decided you were going to switch over and make it fiction? Like, how long did it take?
Well, it took 10 years. And so I'd been writing before that, the nonfiction. But in 2015, I think I took my first fiction writing class. And it was, a big learning curve. I mean, you think you could write a story until you sit down and you try to write a story. And, being trained in the social sciences and being a lawyer, your mind works a certain way. And so I had to I had to learn a lot of new things, and I had to be open to experimenting and rejection and critiques and all of those things that happen when you start something new. And I just stuck with it, and eventually, I felt like it was good enough, or it was the best I could do. And I finished, and I had some beta readers, and they said that it was ready. And so I started pitching agents, and I found my agent pretty quickly, and she submitted it. Took her a few months, not that she's a developmental agent, but because there were some conflicts in her schedule, and she wanted me to actually do a mini proposal, which is very unusual for a fiction submission. But she was a former editor herself, and I think she felt like having a small, a very abbreviated overview of the book with comparative titles, with audience analysis and things like that you typically find in a book proposal for nonfiction. She had me do it for this book. And it actually was a really educational experience for me, but that delayed the process a little bit. And so a week after, the day that she submitted it to agents, she emailed me back and said, someone's very interested. This is the journey begins, or something like that, like this mysterious thing, like the submission being on sub begins. I ended up getting a 2-book deal with Lake Union, which is an imprint of Amazon Publishing. They do historical fiction, women's fiction, book club fiction, contemporary fiction, and they bought my second book on spec because there will be a sequel.
Nice.
Yes. And I did talk to my editors. I said, I think I want to say there's a sequel when I end this book. And they're like, no. And now I've gotten some reviews because I'm an Amazon First Reads editors pick this month.
Oh, congratulations.
So it's been reviewed and out there now for 3 weeks. And some of the reviewers said, wait, it ends abruptly. And so I was thinking to myself, see, I should have stuck to my guns and said we should mention it somewhere that it's going to be continued. But anyway.
Not to get ahead of ourselves, but I feel like it does end open-endedly and does end an arc. So I feel like some people, I think that's a testament to how gripped people were with your story, that they wanted to see what happens next, right? Because this is a historical fiction and the story goes on.
The story goes on. Yes.
You started writing this in 2015, fiction wise. And Pachinko came out in 2017 and
I
it took
know.
the world by storm. And
I know.
It's like, wow, like now there is a collective interest in Korean Japanese diaspora. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, what was your reaction to like seeing Pachinko and like it doing like so well and being like, oh, wow.
Yeah. No, I was like, darn, I should have done this earlier, because it was in my head and it was almost there. But no, I was very happy for Min. She's a friend of mine. I know her. And she actually, when I was, thinking through my book, I talked to her about it and she just said, keep going. And she was very, very supportive. But the response, I think it wasn't initially, as big as it is now. I think it was a gradual process, but I was so grateful when my book was finally ready that there seemed to be an audience for this book. And, so I'm so fortunate that other Asian American writers before me have paved the path to acceptance and to being interested in this period of history and the themes.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, your grandmother's story is just one of many, and that led to you wanting to expand this as a fictional novel. Mm-hmm. I'm curious because you do have a lot of characters with their own stories in your book. How did you go about researching to fill those gaps in addition to your grandmother's story?
Yeah, I had to find a lot of books that were about Koreans living in Korea during the occupation and then Koreans living in Japan during the occupation. And trying to find historic, sort of autobiographical accounts was very difficult. But I read like the autobiography, Richard Kim's Lost Names. He was a young boy who returned to Korea or who was in Korea at the end of World War II or, during the occupation, the end of World War II. And his autobiography was crucial in helping me understand like what everyday life was like. And then I read a lot of books by Korean diaspora writers in Japan at the time, and their stories were tragic. I mean, Into the Light was a short story, and I forget the author's name right now, but the angst and the pain that they felt living in this foreign country that didn't accept them just by virtue of their race, regardless of any knowledge, just culturally accepted that that Korea was a colony and Koreans, were lower class citizens. It was like an accepted fact at the time. And so learning about all that, and I also interviewed my own family members, my father who lived during the time, and my relatives who were in Japan, who still live in Japan, and the discrimination that they faced. And so I synthesized and incorporated as much as I could of those interviews into my novel. And of course, a lot of my own personal experience as an immigrant. And I think I can call this an immigrant story as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's always so interesting, especially, reading stories of immigrants in other countries, but seeing the parallels between like your, Korean Japanese story with like Asian American stories, right? Like parents having to make hard choices to give their children a better life, even if that life means existing in a system where they don't see you as citizens, right? And it's always an interesting reminder that like birthright citizenship, which, is right now currently maybe under siege in this country as well, is not like, it's not a thing that every country has, right? You can be born in Japan and not be considered a citizen. And,
yes,
same.
That's right. And there were a lot of, being a lawyer, I was interested in this sort of legal, background. And they had, Japan had the fingerprinting requirement for all Koreans. When they reached the age of 14, they had to be fingerprinted. And that law was abolished in 1993. But, the remnants of that, the laws are really, they still stay. And I actually went back to Japan this past May and visited some of my relatives. And one of my cousins told me this story. She's now 60. We were celebrating our 60th birthdays together. And she said when she applied for a job, not, when she was, I don't know, in her 40s or something, the manufacturing company wouldn't take her because they knew she was Korean. She had to prove herself in another job, and then she begged for that job again. And then they took her after she proved herself in this other job. So the requirements are much more demanding for Koreans, even still. And that's not the case everywhere. And Japan is a wonderful country and has such a storied history. And but there are pockets, as there are everywhere, of right-wing nationalists and people who believe in the divinity of, their race. And it's amazing how we even think about that now in America today.
And like you said, this book, it is a story about immigration. It is a story about being part of a diaspora. So how did exploring Myung's diaspora identity help you reflect on your own? Do you have a new perspective on your family's migration story and their generational trauma?
Yes. In fact, I had to do a guest article about, my immigration story and the role it played in writing my book. And it played an essential role because, as you said, Marvin, thinking about immigrant stories in a different country, there are so many parallels. And by exploring Myung's immigration story, I felt like I was reliving mine, or being able to draw those scenes and paint those scenes because they came from my personal experience growing up as an immigrant here. I moved here when I was 7. This was 1971, so there weren't many Koreans here back then, or many Asians. And so I was often the only Asian in the room. And I remember feeling so ashamed of standing out and about my culture and my background. And I just wanted to assimilate, or I just wanted to blend in. And assimilation was a big thing then. That was really the only way that Americans were accepted, or foreigners were accepted in society. You just become part of the melting pot. I'm glad to see that changing. I'm glad to see the younger generation embracing their identity more. And I think there's been a shift. And finally, for me, writing this story, I was able to really discover my story, and I wanted a different ending. I didn't want it to be the intergenerational trauma ending of silence, and then we go away. I wanted, I wanted to celebrate this and to share it. And it's scary doing that because you become vulnerable. But I think writing it through fiction, I was really, was able to use my experiences, but step outside myself and really apply it to a character with, her own conflicts, her own goals, her own wounds. And I felt it became a richer story, and it, in essence, became my story because I wrote it. And I think biography and memoirs, they're about that person, right? And that family. They're not about your feelings about that person and that family, and your own personal experience and how that plays into what happens in the story. So I think my immigration experience played a large role in writing and developing Myung's character.
Names play a huge role in your novel, and specifically in the ways that, living under cultural oppression and imperialism forces you to, give up your name and culture in order to survive. And partway through your story, Myung, takes on the Japanese name given to her, Miyoko. And your prose also starts to refer to her by her Japanese name in the narration. Can you tell us about how you decided to use this as a way to portray her internal colonization?
I think as you're writing too, the name becomes important, right? You're writing that character. And I felt like I really needed to get into the head of Miyoko and what she would be thinking. And so, and I didn't want to confuse the reader, because this was happening contemporaneously. And so I never hesitated to use her name, in that part of the novel. But I haven't really thought about that because at the end, she does go back to Myung. But ironically, when you read the second book, you'll find out there's more twists to the name thing. But yeah, I mean, was that jarring as a reader at all?
No, actually. I thought it was very smooth.
It made me a little sad, to be honest. But, it's just understanding that she is assimilating to survive, but it's also losing a part of her identity.
Yeah, when Myung faces backlash from her ethnically Korean peers when she chooses to adopt Miyoko as her name rather than going by a Korean name, I was like, wow, this is very similar to the whole argument of oh, you're too Americanized, you're a banana, you're a Twinkie, you've lost touch with your roots, you are a race traitor. And I'm like, oh.
Yes, I mean, and that, the surprising part is when I read those short stories that the Koreans in Japan wrote during that period, these are literally the same experiences that they talked about. They were going to be ostracized, so they were hiding that they were Korean from other Koreans, and so how hurtful is that? That you can't win either way, and so it was a sad thing to realize that it's probably it's happened then, and it's probably still happening now, to a certain extent. So we just really have to be, I think, as humans, open-minded and understanding of people's choices, and not be judgmental, and understand, try to understand the full picture.
Yeah. I mean, with the 2016 election and the most recent election, not to bring politics into this conversation, but it's unavoidable. I think, as a young Asian American who, has more of a liberal view, it was a little bit jarring to see how many other Asian Americans kind of align themselves with white supremacy and white power. And it was okay, I guess to them, it is survival. It is about clinging to whoever is in charge of the institution. And
yes,
yeah, so I was oh, nothing hasn't really changed that much. Power is it dominates, it changes people's choices, and whoever's in power, if you see this in history, you believe that they are going to save you or protect you, and there will always be that faction. So I don't know. Era.
in every era, I gave a talk to a group of 8 to 11-year-old kids about, they were all interested in writing a book, and my friend who founded the school invited me to speak. And at the end, I got a sweet little card that she had written while I was speaking. And she said, "Thank you for writing this book. History can't be lost." And so I was just like, oh my gosh, this kid got it, and she was 9. And so I think, having books and reading these books, and even in times of crisis like this, it humanizes our experience, and that this isn't, sadly, the first time that it's happened, but maybe it doesn't have to be repeated in the same way.
Definitely agree.
Yeah. So it's been really a great journey to write this and to get the sort of early feedback. My book is due out in 10 days, December 1st. But getting the early responses through Amazon First Reads, I've just been very moved by people who've said that I really needed to read this book in this moment. that their parents were silent about this generation. And thank you for helping me sort of see a glimpse into what their lives might have been like. And so it's the most fulfilling thing as a writer.
I will say, when I was reading your book, I mean, it took a long time for me to pick up pachinko, because I was like, I do not want to face my great grandparents and grandparents' struggles with Japanese occupation. I don't really want to read about that, but I feel like pachinko has primed me to like face that generational trauma and stories like head on. And while I was reading your book, I was like, wow, my family was really, really lucky, because both sides of my family, they prioritize girls' education. So all the women in my family got a college education, or they graduated from high school and became like a teacher. And not just like any teacher, they became an English teacher. And they were able to do this because the women's colleges that are set up today were set up by American missionaries.
Yes.
And Christianity has such an interesting history with Korea.
Yeah.
Evangelical Christians make up a good portion of South Korea. I would say around like 20%. But in the 19th century, Christians were outsiders. They were a foreign religion. No one really wanted to accept it because it went against Confucian society. So I just kind of want to hear your thoughts on like how you made that a part of Myung's journey.
Yes. Well, it's, it's based on my grandmother's life. And this actually happened, is that when she lived outside Pyongyang, and Pyongyang was a hotbed for the spread of Christianity. And she was a devout Christian in her 90s before she passed away. She was an elder at her church. She really had this faith that Christianity saved her. And, I didn't really talk about, that wasn't the focus of the book, but faith and her faith, because of her circumstances and because of how it saved her. I hope that message got across, that this was her only way, that she was going to escape her circumstances. And I think that early exposure to it, she was unwavering in a lot of ways, despite, all the negative associations with Christianity as well. It was an important part of her life, and the life that she shared with her husband for a short time. And researching about the missionaries, I listened to your talk with Joanne Howard. Joanne Howard. So interesting about her family's background in India and the American missionaries in India. And I can't wait to pick up her book, because I think it sounds so fascinating. One of my primary resources that I used for excavating that part of the book was that the history was, there's a journal called Women's World that female missionaries in these foreign countries would do a newsletter describing their interactions with the natives. And there was a lot written about Korea. And those are they started in 1915. So they went on for about 40 years. And so I collected the ones that were around the same time period. But, even the scene about, breastfeeding on demand versus on a schedule, that came from that missionary journal. And so that was such a gold mine, finding that, because there weren't women, first of all, didn't read or write a lot of the time during that period. So for women in the West to memorialize what they were observing, it was fantastic as a researcher. So I took those accounts to heart and weaved them into my story, where it was applicable.
Yeah, like it is so interesting that Christianity like gave so many opportunities to girls and, education and being able to read. That is, a right that, we didn't always have. And I think it's like it was very timely for me to read your book because right now in Korea, there's like a protest going on at the women's colleges because Tongduk Women's College and I think another women's college that's been around since like the founding of South Korea, they are going to start accepting male students. And there was an uproar from the students who are at these colleges because they're like, this is our safe space. And considering what is happening to Korean women with like violence and digital sex crimes, like this is our space. This is a place where women's education and freedom and feminism is put first, and to have it be violated like this is not right. And of course, that sparked anti-feminist men to just invade the campus. And it's been a really interesting time to read this book and being like, yeah, education for girls and having women, have like, I don't know, like the privilege to pursue higher education and to carve out a career for themselves. I was like, yeah, this is still something that we fight even in today's space. So yeah, very timely read for me.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to look up what's happening. I'm not surprised, and I'm thinking that, the administration's decision to consider turning it co-ed comes from financial reasons.
Oh, yeah.
I went to an all-women's college, and we've had that. I went to Smith undergrad, and part of the Seven Sisters colleges back east. And we have that debate every few years. And a lot of the women's colleges have turned co-ed. It's usually 80% women, 20% men, and it gradually becomes more integrated. But like Vassar and other colleges have become co-ed from being single-sex institutions. But I think primarily it's for financial reasons. But when these debates come up, you're always thinking like, I loved my single-sex education because it was my safe space and I didn't have to compete with the men in the room for my voice. And that was a special time because once I got out into the world, the world changes and your role in that environment changes. So I'm so glad that this book touched you at this time and that we can't take education for granted, women's education.
Yeah, reading is political. We've said this so many times. And even if you're reading historical fiction, it can apply to today's politics and current issues. I do want to touch on a major theme in your book. Motherhood is a recurring theme. It is a very big part of Myung's journey. And you have 3 different mothers that are like pretty much in the forefront of your novel. You have Myung's mother, and you have Hojun's mother, and then you have Myung herself as a mother. So what did you want to illustrate with these different portrayals of a mother's love?
Well, we all have mothers, right? And we all know that they love in different ways. And I've certainly experienced that in my own life. I have a mother-in-law, I have my mother, I have my grandmother. I think mothers are very complicated. And I myself am a mother. And my motivations come from a good place, but it's not always executed in the way that I want it to be. And it has an impact on the children that you don't see because they don't express it. Because expressions of feeling, we don't talk about our feelings in Asia. So how we're parented has an impact, although it's not ever really talked about. Again, this is probably my exploration of my own mothering and where I got it from. and all these different factors at play. I didn't have a mother-in-law like Hojun's mother, thank goodness. But there are mother-in-laws like that. I mean, I know them personally. I've heard about them. And I think, I'm more like the Myung mom as a mom. And so
acts of service. Yeah.
acts of service, and also having a career and having interests outside of motherhood, and the tension, that creates of, am I a good enough mother? Because I have these career interests. Should I stay at home, take care of the children? And, the whole childcare situation too, it's ever present. It's still now, women, can work from home, but, they're still the primary nurturer. And so we haven't changed that much when you look at how women still play the primary role in child rearing. But yes, mothers are complicated and have the best of intentions, but there's consequences, and sometimes they come at a cost, but you can only do your best.
Yeah. I mean, Myung does make some questionable decisions at the end of your book, and it does raise up the questions of like, is she, as a mother, is she making the right choice, or is this a selfish choice? Which kind of brings me towards the end of our interview. And you mentioned that you have a sequel coming out. So I am guessing this is about Myung's son, Ko-chan, and they are back in Korea, and they're heading back to Pyongyang. And the anxiety in me spiked because Japanese occupation ends in 1945, and then, like, shortly after, there's, like, the division of the Koreas. And as people know, Pyongyang is in North Korea. So I'm like, oh, my goodness, this sounds like a very, very stressful move and a very stressful book, because I'm like, are they going to stay in North Korea, or are they going to find a way out? So that was, like, my whole mindset when I finished your book.
Yes. Well, that's good, because you're an educated reader and you know about what happens. you know what happens. So you're nervous for them, right? And I'm nervous for them too as I'm writing it, because, oh my gosh, they go through so much. And in the second book, it's interesting because it is more intergenerational book. And I'll be exploring more of those intergenerational dynamics. But yeah, a lot happens. And I hope to be able to humanize, that part of that era in history as well. And I hope I've done it, with the people who migrated, with the Koreans who migrated to Japan during the occupation. I hope I could, serve the story with the sequel as well. But it is very, it's going to be very dramatic, and there's going to be lots of twists and turns. But
yeah, I'm excited to read it.
Oh,
anxious,
thank you.
But excited.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this episode will release on December 6th. So your book just came out earlier this week. So congratulations on your debut.
Thank you.
Good luck
Thank
with
you
how
so
far are
much.
you with the second book so far?
Well, I was working on it this morning, trying to forget all the stuff that I'm doing pre-launch related and book tours and things like that. I'm about page 60 right now. So I have a long way to go before my August 1st, 2025 deadline. It took me 10 years to write.
It zips by, though, the deadline, especially when it's your second book and you are writing on deadline. You do not have the luxury of writing at your own pace anymore.
I know. Yes. It's going to be as harrowing as the journey that they're about to take.
Not as harrowing, I hope.
No. But it's going to be it's going to be demanding, I think.
Well, good luck on meeting your deadlines. We're rooting for you. And congratulations on your debut. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you, Dida.
And that was Rosa Kwon Easton. Her debut novel, White Mulberry, is now available at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookshop. So if you enjoyed our conversation and would like to pick up a copy of the book, head on over to booksandboba.com and check out our online bookstore, where all purchases support not only us at Books and Boba, but also your local bookstores. I guess before we go, Rira, can you remind us what we are reading for book club for December 2024?
So December is my pick. So I chose Kim Ji-young, born 1982. And it's by Korean author Cho Nam-ju and translated by Jamie Chang. And it's a very short book. It's around like 170 pages. It was translated in 2020, so it's been out for 4 years now. And it's pretty much about how Korean women face misogyny in Korean modern day society. There were a lot of women who picked up this book when it came out in Korea and were absolutely shunned and stalked online for reading such a feminist book. It's still a very much a contested book in like Korean manosphere. So I thought it would be a timely read. And of course, with the holidays, we want something short. So I am excited to dig into this book. I know it's been recommended by our Patreon members in the past, so I hope you guys read along with us.
Yeah, excited to get into this, short but also full of righteous anger, which, sometimes we need some of that this holiday season, right?
My brand. We should bring someone who is just as angry as me. I think it would make for a very fiery conversation.
Yeah, we'll look into that. As always, we are doing a read-along on Discord if you are a Patreon supporter, so make sure to keep tabs on the discussion channel to give your thoughts. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and still would like to weigh in, you can do so on our Goodreads forums. As always, we love to include your feedback on our discussion episodes whenever possible. But yeah, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you once again to Rosa Kwon Easton for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey Candace, we are so excited to have you join me and Kathy for a brand new season of the Korean Drama Podcast, the podcast about watching Korean dramas by people who don't watch Korean dramas.
I'm so excited to join the podcast, but where's Kathy? She said she'd meet us here.
Candace, I'm right here.
Why is Kathy's voice coming from this chicken meatball?
So, funny story. I was so busy watching Korean dramas on my phone to prepare for this podcast that I accidentally walked into a mysterious machine and got turned into food. And, excuse me, Kim, I'm obviously a chicken nugget.
Agree to disagree.
Well, that's a weird coincidence because for our 5th season of the Korean Drama Podcast, we're watching the comedy sci-fi series Chicken Nugget.
Join us each week as we discuss the highs and lows of Chicken Nugget episode by episode.
So grab a snack, maybe not chicken nuggets, and follow us on your favorite podcast app, part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.
You're totally going to eat me, aren't you?